Well, welcome everyone. I guess I'm a little in the way here. So I'm going to talk about brain-computer interfaces. I want to start with a disclaimer. My name's Ben. We have a team at Arctop. We specialize in brain-computer interfaces. We are not specialists in finance or in fintech. So this talk is going to be structured mostly as kind of talking about our technology, potentially the why of using brain-computer interfaces in finance, and then I'm going to speculate a little bit about applications in a financial context. But would also invite participation on your end because obviously you know your own workflows and your own work. So why use brain-computer interfaces in finance? It seems like a bit of a far-fetched question. The earliest mention I can see of this in academic literature goes back 1 or 2 years where someone looked at EEG in traders, so sort of brain activity signals as they're trading, looking at overconfidence. So it's a fairly recent question to ask. It's also one that's maybe, finance is an industry where the proof is in the pudding is probably the adage of the industry, right? So your results, whatever you deliver, if you're consistently outperforming the market for 10 years, then that's the proof in the pudding. So why would you care about more than the outcome? I was reading this book called Atomic Habits a few months ago, and sort of this quote stood out to me. You don't rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the level of your systems. Obviously, what he's talking about is personal habits in this context, right? But the idea, I think, is the same and applies in a lot of different areas, which is whatever the output you're producing, if your systems aren't performing at a certain level, or if they're not systematized, or you don't understand them, then there's variability in the outcomes. And what system is more complex than the human brain, right? So you have the neurophysiology of it all, the physical structure on the left, or you have the output of the brain, the ways in which it can misfire, so the cognitive biases. Historically, if you wanted to measure any of these things, what you would do is, for example, as far as neurophysiology is concerned, you would hook someone up to an EEG headset, you would put on fMRI, or you put them in large machines, specialized machines in labs, and you would observe them in that controlled environment. Conversely, if you want to look at biases, you would have psychologists, teams doing that in a research setting, right? So there hasn't really been a way historically to look at what the brain is doing in the context in which decisions are being made. And so as a default, we can only care about outcomes, really, or we can only observe outcomes. So if someone's outperformed the market for the last 10 years, we kind of assume they're probably doing a good job. But as we all know in finance, past results do not guarantee future performance, right? So there's a ton of blind spots that come with that. We can't see the process that created the results. We can't detect why certain decisions failed or succeeded. Sort of bias, fatigue, overconfidence, all of these things are hidden until it's too late. And there's no opportunity for real-time intervention. If something goes wrong, it's kind of a post-mortem analysis that needs to take place. And we've built entire industries around measuring the scoreboard. But without understanding the individual's condition and cognition, we're blind to the root causes of performance. So we can't improve the system itself. Go for it. We're missing real-time measurement of this system that makes the decisions. And our whole motto and sort of reason to exist at Arctop is that we believe that what can be measured can be bettered. And this is, in the last couple of years, it's become possible to measure the brain and what the brain does. So I'm going to talk a bit about our approach here. Just this feels a bit lofty and sort of theoretical about how exactly we leverage brain. So this is our first step in our proprietary process. This is me going through, just kidding. No, so what we're looking for is brain activity, right? So electrical signals, this is an EEG chart. It sort of time series data looks very similar to EKG or EMG, muscle, heart, potentially maybe some penny stocks that are highly correlated. But in any case, it's a data that is available, that is being produced all the time by our brain, right? You can put the microphone, basically sensors, inside the skull, and you're going to have a very good idea of what the sound that is coming out is saying as it relates to the brain, or you can put it from outside the skull. Yeah, of course. Or you can put it outside the skull, all right? So if you put it on skin, on head, there's a very thick skull there. It attenuates the signal. You have eye movement, muscle movement, various forms of motion artifacts. Like there's a lot of noise, right? So the microphone's picking up a lot of sounds that aren't just brain. But it's a solvable problem if you specialize in software, right? So the software level, if you analyze that data, you're able to isolate the various sources of noise, you can really get to the kernel of brain. But it is a very hard problem, right? If you think of an eye blink on an EEG where you have a sensor placed on the head, an eye blink is about 100 times louder than the actual brain activity. So it's an extremely lossy signal, it's extremely noisy, and it's a hard data problem to solve. The way you solve it is you get more and more data and you train models on it. And so that's what we've done for the last 9 years. We've done work with Stanford Medical School, I mean, all of these, but US Air Force Academy. I'll talk about some of these specific use cases in a second, but we spent the last 9 years collecting a large database of labeled data that enables us to train models and really understand how to decode the brain's activity, as noisy as it might be, non-invasively. And so we have patents, trade secrets, and sort of certain ways of handling that information in a way that allows us to be interoperable across devices. A quick note on our founding. So 2016, Dan and Eitan started Arctop. Eitan's more on the cybersecurity and software engineering side. Dan is a computational neuroscientist who, after he graduated from Harvard, worked for a year on building a brain-computer interface for Stephen Hawking, who, for good reasons, did not want his brain messed with, even though he was in a wheelchair, right? So what he was interested in is some kind of way to replace the cheek click. So at the time, he had an Intel-supplied sort of infrared sensor looking at his cheek. If he moves his cheek, that's a selection mechanism. And so what they were looking for was a brain-controlled binary yes or no, right? So that's what Dan worked on for about a year, and then he went to do a PhD where, you know, at the time, this was 2014, 2015, kind of the state of the art of computational neuroscience is that you can't tell apart the intended movement of right arm more than the intended movement of right arm or left arm. So if you look at those squiggly signals, if you apply some filter to it, some model to it, if someone intends to move their right arm or left arm, you can tell those signals apart, but nothing really more granular than that. And what Dan's PhD established is that the level of individual fingers, you can actually tell those signals apart. So we've really been founded from the beginning with this idea that there is much more data in that signal than was previously thought possible. And that's really what we've set out to build. So we built a software platform, sensor-agnostic, non-invasive software platform for decoding brain data at high resolution. The schematic is always going to be the same, however we deploy the technology. On the left, we have our headwear, which is going to be something like AR glasses, VR, headsets, sleep headbands, earbuds, headphones. Anything that's on skin, on head, will receive some kind of brain signal. The location, there's various configurations that might have impacts on what the application is. But that's the hardware stack. And then on the software, we sit in the middle of that. We receive the raw brain data, and then we output a variety of things, all via API. So essentially, like, data's being pushed out. You can use it for third-party applications. I'll talk a bit about some of the use cases in a second. But the outputs that we can provide, for example, are something like a brain ID. And I'll talk a bit about this one in the next slide. Or measurements like focus, enjoyment, cognitive workload, all the others below. And what I mean by these measurements, just to be more specific, it's scale 0 to 100 in real time. You're able to query that data, right? So if I were wearing a headband right now, you could say, oh, Ben is at a 90 in focus right now and a 20 in enjoyment, right? And so we can leverage this in a lot of ways. Pretty foundational to our intellectual property is this idea of the brain ID. And part of it is because as the brain exists and it senses things, there's kind of a variance, which is the shifting cognition, emotion, perception. And there's so that's the variance, and then the invariance is pretty unique to each individual. So there's kind of has been this perception that, you know, sort of high beta means high focus, sort of the various frequencies of the brain mean something. But really, it's much more individualized than was thought. So we kind of baked into our models an understanding that each individual's brain is different. There's a signature there, and we can identify that signature pretty quickly. So this is like, you know, a ream of maybe 3 seconds of EEG data. In 2 seconds, we can identify an individual. There's a ton of applications for this, like, you know, no username, no password needed, authentication, all these kinds of areas. This has not necessarily been our commercialization pathway. It's just a capability that we have that's inherent to enabling the accuracy of our cognitive decoding. And so how do we leverage the cognitive decoding? So this is probably the most recent example in terms of work that we're doing right now. We were awarded a $1.2 million direct to phase 2 SBIR grant. That stands for Small Business Innovation Research R&D grant, organized by the US Department of Defense to provide cognition adaptive simulators to the US Air Force Academy. What does that mean? So let me be a bit more concrete here. As cadets come into the US Air Force Academy, they might be training for 4 years to become Air Force pilots, for example. They need to acquire a variety of skills that will help them do that. One of those skills might be something like the identification of threats and then deploying appropriate countermeasures. So the way that they might train that might be in a simulator, kind of like a video game, where it says missile is inbound. You have to identify the type of missile that it is, deploy an appropriate countermeasure, and do that. And so the project that we're doing here is you have a cadet. going through that simulator. In between the simulator and the cadet is an AI decision-making agent in the cloud that's receiving real-time data from the simulator in terms of what the simulator is doing, and real-time data from the cadet in terms of what their cognition is doing. And in real time, it computes that and uses that to adjust the parameters of the simulator. So it's adapting to the cadet to ultimately optimize the time to proficiency, right? To shorten it, to challenge them at just the right level so that they're able to learn faster. Another way that we've applied this, we've done some work with Endel, which is the Apple Watch app of the year in 2020, measuring the ability of various background audio to enhance the focus of someone as they're doing a cognitively intensive task. So they might be, reading, or they might be sewing, or whatever it might be. And there's some background audio. So Endel obviously is an AI generating soundscape, also an Apple focus playlist, a Spotify focus playlist, and silence. And so we published this research in Frontiers in Computational Neuroscience, and sort of enabled Endel, for example, to enhance their algorithms to maximize focus even more, because if it's AI generated, you can identify which specific patterns for each individual are most associated with elevated focus. Maybe anecdotally, one of the interesting findings in this paper is that for those who were younger than 36, sort of the AI generated soundscape was best for maximizing focus. For those over 36, silence was the best. So it tells you something about the way that we consume music and how that's shifted in the last few decades. Another way that we've used our technology is not in the awake state, but in the sleep state. This is based on a protocol that was developed at Harvard and MIT. It's called the Dormio protocol, and the idea was, as you're entering sleep, you're entering a state called hypnagogia. It's kind of this transitory state between awake and asleep. And in hypnagogia, your brain's a bit more plastic. It's more suggestible. And what they did at Harvard using a glove that measured muscle tone is that as you were falling asleep, the muscle tone relaxed. It triggered an audio cue that would say something like, think of a tree, or think of a cat. And then they would wake people up out of their nap after the nap was finished, and they would say, what did you dream of? And they had about a 70% success rate in incubating a certain concept into a dream. And so we've taken that one step further. We've applied our technology to it in a therapeutic context. And there's a hospital in Israel right now that's trialing this for people who have diagnosed PTSD, where one of the most problematic symptoms is this recurring nightmare. The moment they're falling asleep, nightmare occurs, it really affects the quality of sleep, and ultimately sleep is what would help heal their brain, right? So how can you nudge them towards restorative sleep? So what we're doing with them is, as they're falling asleep, you detect that they're falling asleep, they're maybe about to enter a nightmare, you wake them up very gently, very slightly, you provide a targeted audio that says, maybe think of a cat, think of a tree, but actually we're going beyond that. And with the help of a therapist, they'll find a safe context words, maybe their childhood bedroom, whatever it might be, and then you use that to incubate the intended or engineered dream, right? So this is ongoing work, and sort of the moment we have data to share, I'd love to do so. Penultimate use case here, just to talk a bit more about, we talk a lot about LLMs these days, and sort of there's kind of an arms race on those and how they perform. Really, it's neck and neck between Anthropic and OpenAI and all these others. Like, they kind of game the metrics for themselves. How can they differentiate themselves, and how can they really kind of get closer to this era of AGI? Well, we feel that cognition is kind of the missing link here, right? So it's a conversational. If you're talking to ChatGPT, it doesn't really know how you're feeling when it's talking to you. It's missing that empathic layer of human communication. And so we've built a demo experience, and I have video I can share if anyone's interested, of our CEO essentially having an interaction with a chatbot. And he says, maybe explain something to me about quantum physics. And the chatbot starts talking in a very technical way. And maybe a couple sentences in, it realizes his attention's flagging, he's not getting it. So it interrupts itself and says, oh, okay, let me shift gears. Maybe a metaphor would help here. Maybe I'll simplify the language, right? And the last use case is more just traditional brain-computer interface. Again, this is less what we have necessarily commercialized, but we've built capabilities in this area just to show what's possible. And so we built an application called TopScope, essentially simple shooter game, user right thumb to activate a scope, left thumb to shoot, and brain to zoom in and out. So I've given you an idea of how our technology works and how it's been applied. I'm going to speculate wildly as to how to apply this in financial context. I don't necessarily know the answer, but just to get the creative juices flowing here. So first one is training. Again, we mostly have commercialized in the area of training and human performance. There's a lot to learn in the world of finance. So If there's any way you can shorten the training pipeline for the acquisition of finance-specific knowledge and skills relevant to a variety of jobs, then that's a potentially great use case, right? So if you're studying for the CFA exam or you have an instructor who's doing this, it's able to tailor in the same way as the USAFA project that I was describing. It's able to tailor to maybe the modality that you learn best under. It's able to understand, oh, you're really struggling with this concept, and it accelerates the way that you learn. We can also look at this in maybe a team decision-making or dashboard context, where if you maybe have a team of traders working under you, yes, you have their performance metrics up in front, but you know nothing about how they're feeling, what they're doing. And obviously, if someone's in an emotionally aroused state, then maybe they're going to make worse decisions. So if you have access to their cognitive data as they are doing their work, then maybe you can, you can adjust in all kinds of ways, right? So I don't necessarily know in a trading context whether having low cognitive workload or a high cognitive workload is a good thing, but if you tie it to the performance metrics that they're achieving, then as the supervisor, you might really have valuable data there. You might have conversation you might want to have. There might be a point at which you cut someone off, like they're totally maxed out cognitively, who knows? And then one more idea I just wanted to float is kind of along those lines, right? Sort of rather than sort of team dashboard, just this in general, this concept of real-time risk management, right? If someone's throwing around hundreds of thousands of dollars, maybe they're at this level of risk exposure. If they're on the far end of emotional arousal, cognitive overload, and fatigue, maybe you just want to intervene at this level. If they're sort of in an emotional state, but it's a low risk, then maybe you don't care so much, right? But there's all kinds of ways that you can flag someone being in a suboptimal decision-making state and prevent that. Okay, and so this is end of me speculating, but really I want to leave you with sort of two core messages here. One is this idea of data, right? Sort of you guys are extremely familiar with data. No one has ever said more data is bad, right? So thinking of cognition as a data feed that we can add to your workflows for any purpose, right? The financial data stack expands when cognition becomes measurable, creating a powerful new input for risk management, training, and strategic decision making. So you can overlay it on, trader feeds. You can use it in a myriad ways. It's just an additional source of information, right? And then taking it one step further, you can think of it as a kind of symbiosis. There are ways that you can leverage it. When we talk about adaptive technology or adapting at the US Air Force Academy, you're really talking about a symbiotic link between what a human's doing cognitively and then the way that the technology understands that and adapts to the individual. So you might have the technology receiving sort of understanding of the cognition that the person is experiencing, and then also context and heuristics, and it's receiving all that data, and it uses that to compute a variety of changes that bring technology to us, right? For the last 100 years, we've always had to learn how to use technology on its terms, but it never really understands us. Now we're kind of bringing that loop together and creating a kind of symbiosis. And so just on that note, we're open to all kinds of collaborations and work. Academic collaborations are always great, so to help you test hypotheses and provide data. For those of you who are practitioners, there's all kinds of ways we can work and also provide data. We can provide SDK, API. We can also build custom solutions. And yeah, that's us. Any questions? Yeah.
Do you have any experiments or use cases that involve, for example, driving or activities?
So driving. So we've had some conversations. I was actually at a demo day show for Volkswagen a couple of years ago, and sort of had a lot of conversations around that. One of the challenges in driving is the connection to the head, right? So if you have a sensor in the back seat, I guess, and your head's against it, then you're able to receive data. But there's always the question of sort of the exact configuration. And so we haven't done any work necessarily there, but I know that there's some automotive companies that are looking into cognitive monitoring in a driving context.
So the way it works is that there's kind of a helmet or something?
No, so actually, let me see if I can show you. Yeah. You guys can pass this around as well. But
we should have a volunteer so that you can read his mind. Maybe I'm happy to be the guinea pig.
So actually, I will be over there, and if anyone wants to go through a calibration process where they'll, basically calibrate themselves for cognitive workload, and then we can run some tests and collect data afterwards. Yeah. But just to give you an idea, so that hardware is it should feel and look exactly like any form of hardware that you've used as a consumer, right? So it doesn't need to be a helmet at all, right? This is part of the point is we're taking it outside of the lab, outside of really onerous hardware. That's an in-ear earbud, that's over-ear headphones. It's going to be integrated into the hardware that you use regularly. Actually, Apple released a patent in 2023 for AirPods with EEG sensors integrated, and part of the patent is about which sensors engage when they're in contact, right? So you're seeing huge consumer companies make this kind of move. Any other questions?
How much time do you need to decode the data from the EEG?
Yeah.
I know that it's kind of like long process. It was long process before.
Yes.
Because I started in marketing back to Italy.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
Yeah, that's why I know a bit about this technology. That's why I'm interested, because you said it's kind of fast.
Yes. So great question. So there's two ways to bucket it. One is sort of the calibration of the models, right, and understanding how long that takes. For us, it used to take hours to calibrate models. So this means like data collection, you're wearing a sensor and you're going through various tests and trying to nudge about. It used to be hours for us. Now we're at a point where within a couple of minutes, you can calibrate your cognitive workload, for example. So once you've done that and you start recording, you have an associated account to the model that you've calibrated, the data is essentially in real time. So in terms of if you're thinking of like your brain emits some electrical signal that then goes to the phone that then processes that and then produces an output, that's at the scale of like 50 milliseconds, right? So it's near instant speed. Yeah.
It's really impressive.
Thank you. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
I had a company 2 years ago that we invested in a program, and it's an LLM-based company, and they're in the training world. So
right.
Basically, for banks, they actually provide avatars that represent customers, and the new people. There's a lot of turnover, of course, in customer service personnel.
Sure.
And so people can train without actually having to train on the customer. It's hugely successful. So I'm immediately thinking, like adding to that, to have like interaction, or like the Air Force guys could be
right.
super helpful.
Yeah.
Now, so two things you said about the calibration. So you do need to have every single brain that uses it go through a special calibration. Does that need to be with a specialist?
No. So really, it's if you think about the calibration process right now, you can go through it out there, but basically it's like a bunch of math games. If we're talking about cognitive workload, it might be a little bit of mental math for a couple minutes. Super accessible. You need to do nothing. You download the app, you create an account. That's all it is. So really, no specialist setup required. And even the calibration itself, it really depends on what you're trying to do. For example, our top scope of the game, where you zoom in and out, not really any calibration. There's a tutorial, you go through the tutorial. The tutorial basically acts as the baseline. So you just go into it as normal. So it's really, the point is not to be onerous, but you create an account, you go through a couple minutes, and then that's valid for years potentially. It doesn't really expire, the calibration, until like several years.
So then the second barrier a little bit is you do have to have some hardware, and at this moment it's specialized. It's like
yes.
when the airports come out, it might be at some point that everybody has that in their pocket, but that's of course not the case.
Exactly, yeah. There's a bit of a chicken and egg in BCI space, especially non-invasive space, where exactly we're kind of dependent on a mass volume of hardware that currently isn't there. I will say the headphones over there, these are recently commercialized, and they're scaling up really quickly. So there is going to be, and they're also talking about like building this kind of sensor set into other form factors at much larger scale. So we're really kind of seeing this inflection point that's been happening the last couple of years, where maybe 10 years ago it would have been a dream, but really we're kind of seeing those integrations. So give it a couple more years, and I think we will see that kind of scale. And what we're doing in the meantime was just trying to get the software as good as it can be, so that by the time that it's at scale, if you get the raw data, there's only so much you can determine unless you really have that specialized software.
You said in the beginning that every brain has its own ID.
Yes.
Is it somehow inherited from parents? And the second thing, is it for the whole life the same ID?
Yes.
Or does it change over time? Because your brain is working in the different, let's say, phases over time. So
that's a great question. So absolutely, it does shift. And one of the really interesting things about brain ID as a whole, and just brain signal, is that there is a drift over time. And that drift is sort of, there's the There's the just technical side of it, where the electric signal can drift over time. And then there's also the fact that the brain changes over time, right? Generally, what we have seen is in the order of 2 years, there isn't really any change that affects the performance of our outputs. If you look at maybe a 5 to 10 year time scale, you might need to recalibrate, right? So that's the limitation. Yeah.
Well, and I missed the first minutes. Maybe you
Yeah.
started out with that. But is there any, for example, on the training, is there any data that it actually works it's beneficial to use this data, or is that still being tested? For example,
Right.
the Air Force guys,
Yeah.
does it work? Like, do they train better?
Right. So with the Air Force case, it's still in progress, so the data we'll have. Another context in which we've used our technology has been at Stanford Medical School. And what we did at Stanford is we were looking at the cognition of experienced surgeons alongside trainees to look at their cognition during about 2-hour laparoscopic surgeries. So these are surgeries where sort of they don't necessarily, they're not making large incisions, it's like through cameras. And so a lot of focus is required, and they're relatively short surgeries, about 2 hours. And so they were looking at the cognition dynamics for experienced surgeons alongside residents in training, and using that to then coach the residents to train them faster. What we heard from Stanford is that the brain data, they were using a lot of different sensors to look at expertise and sort of quantify that surgical skill. The brain data was the most differentiated way to quantify that skill. So we didn't get as far as to say, you know, the way that you then adapt as a result of that might have X percentage decrease in time to train. But what we did have is an outcome that determined that compared to all the other sensors that you could be using, in the brain is where you can measure expertise and skill, right? Perfect. Awesome. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it.